Good morning to you. I hope you're with us now by the miracles of technology. We've had 1 or 2 hiccups in rehearsal, I think it's fair to say. Sunday Supplement, or indeed Sunday Skyplement, is back. We're sorry that we haven't been able to deliver to you your normal weekly roundup of the newspapers, but hopefully normal circumstances have been resumed, or as normal as you can get in the current circumstances. So I'm particularly delighted to welcome our guest this morning, the Chief Football Writer of the Times, Henry Winter, the Chief Sports Writer of the Mail, Martin Samuel, and the Chief Football Writer of the Daily Mirror, John Cross. Now, Crossy, I'm reliably informed that normally on set, you're the only one who actually eats the croissants. So I've come prepared, and I've got a few for you. Here you go, fella. Help yourself.
Lovely. Thanks very much indeed, Geoff.
Now, there may well be no football for the guys and girls to write about right now, but there are plenty of stories. So let's just get a flavour of today's newspapers. Starting with Ollie Holt in the Mail, really strong headline attached to this piece as well. Denying Liverpool the title, refusing Leeds promotion because you loathe them is no reason to void the season. Ending now, it's just about clubs trying to dodge failure. Over in the Times, Jonathan Northcroft talks about Project Restart and the obstacles that football inevitably will face when they try and get going once again. Now, Neil Fizzler in the Sunday Express, quite interesting this one. He's got more on the Aubameyang contract situation at Arsenal. Apparently Inter Milan now leading the race, talks of a £50 million plus bid there. Staying with Arsenal, really interesting development this. Andy Williams in the Star talks about Arsenal being the first Premier League club to go back into training as the season return ramps up. In the Telegraph, Matt Law, a fairly familiar theme at the moment, he talks about the ongoing discussion between Chelsea and their players regarding wage cuts or indeed deferrals. So there are a huge number of stories right now with regards to football. But in truth, the only one on every fan's mind, or right at the forefront of their mind, is when is it going to be back? So, Henry, if I start with you, from the work you've been doing, what do you make of a likely date for return for action to resume?
Well, no one knows. I mean, the only people who really know are the government scientists. I mean, the Premier League have got a very good medical advisor in Dr. Mark Gillette, and obviously the clubs are talking all the time, which is vital. I can understand why they want to plan ahead. There's broadcast money, there are legal issues. They have to sort of plan and look after staff. I understand that, but really, this decision can only be taken by people who are really on the front line against the pandemic. The work of the amazing NHS. And also the scientists who are working to decide when it's going to be safe. So look, football is important. We're all missing it. I understand, like you guys have been talking to players and managers, and they're desperate to get back. And there's in the Sunday Tale today by James Ducker on the mental health and the PFA's concerns about players. But really, the most important thing is the health of this country, and it's what the NHS are doing, and it's what the scientists decide. Football has always lived in a bubble, but it's actually had to break out of that bubble now and realise that there's a real world out there, and that there are people on the front line, there are people dying. And the thought of football rushing back, I understand Arsenal, they're taking players back in training, and there are going to be a lot of eyes on the Bundesliga to see how they can ease their way back in. But really, football's got to appreciate its place in the modern world, in this modern situation, this pandemic that we're in, and not rush back, because it would be horrific if you've got with people dying, with NHS people still not having all the sort of PPE that they need, with tests going to footballers and for people going to grounds. That would be completely wrong. So I think football needs to obviously plan, I understand that, but there needs to be a little bit more perspective that there are bigger issues at play here. Look, we're all missing football, but it cannot be rushed back.
Martin, I'm sure we all echo Henry's thoughts there with regard to perspective, but at the same time, like virtually every other business, football does have to plan for its return eventually, and when that might be. Of course, it's a movable feast. Again, as Henry says, you have to be led by health and also by the government's advice. But based on what we know, or probably don't know, right now. What does football have to be mindful of in terms of when it can return? What sort of shape might we start to see in terms of the first games returning, as and when?
Well, you can't base something on what you don't know, basically. So you can't put a date on it. There is no date for football's return. There's no date for the new season. There's no date for international fixtures. When the PGA Golf talked about coming back, they talked about needing, I think it was 1 million. They were all doing 1 million tests to try to get 3 or 4 golf tournaments on. That's the sort of scale you would be talking about if football was to try to exist in a little bubble outside the rest of society where football can just sort of carry on as usual but without the crowds. So it really is unrealistic at the moment to talk about any sort of when it can return or how it can return, because you really do not know. You don't know what travel plans will be like, because it's not necessarily the ground as such. It's the travelling to the ground. It's the mass transportation. If you take golf, you take the Ryder Cup. The next Ryder Cup is at Whistling Straits. Everyone travels from Milwaukee. It would be ridiculous at the moment to try to get a Ryder Cup crowd from Milwaukee to Whistling Straits in a succession of coaches. Well, if you think about football, football is trains, coaches, everything. I mean, the idea that you're going to try to get people on coaches, people on trains, it would be unthinkable at the moment, and we don't know when it will be achieved again. Then you're talking about behind closed doors. You need PPE tests off the scale, because it's pointless testing on Monday and then thinking, oh, that means we're all right next week, because you're not. So it's an absolutely unfathomable question at the moment. Absolutely unfathomable at the moment. And, good luck to the Bundesliga for trying, but they've got a different situation in Germany, because they have got massive testing centres. They have more testing centres in Germany to begin with, pharmaceutical testing centres. They are the biggest in Europe. Germany were better set up for this than we were to begin with as a country. It's not a surprise that they're the ones that think they can get back earliest. But even that, I think it would be very dangerous to think that we're at the same level as Germany are, because we're not.
So, John, based on what Martin and Henry have said there, right now, what do you think football clubs should actually be doing right now?
Well, it's very interesting to read Jonathan Northcroft's piece in the Sunday Times, for example, simply because I think if you analyse that, he's talking about return to training in June, which, if you think about it, that is immediately pushing back on what we previously thought. The Premier League and Premier League clubs were initially talking about a return to training May the 18th, and then basically best case scenario, June the 8th, return to football, return to some sort of normality with games behind closed doors, and then hopefully finishing in mid-July. That seems remarkably optimistic, most reckless, I have to say, to me, because as the guys were previously saying, we've also got to think about the health and safety of the players. The players are clearly desperate to play again. Of course they are. But we also have to keep them safe. We have to keep their families safe. That to me, continually gets overlooked, the health and welfare of players and their families. And also the strain, the extra demands on already overstretched emergency services. Can you imagine telling the emergency services, sorry, you can't go to the hospital today because you've kind of got to man the fort at a Premier League ground to test and sort of steward all these people coming in to even behind closed doors. You're going to have huge numbers. One Premier League club told me last week that you would need something in the region of 256 bare minimum for their ground to do a behind closed doors game. I mean, that's players, staff, that's media, that's everyone. So that's a lot of people. And then you're also talking about the worry about fans still turning up en masse because they want to come and support their team and they're desperate to get their football back. So you need extra stewarding, policing, arguably, for that. So I just think at the moment we just have to be so careful on this. I think Ollie Holt raises a great point in his piece, in that, of course, we want to complete the season. Of course we do. But I just think that we are trying to be forced and rushed into something. UEFA laying down this desire to play the Champions League final on August the 29th as some sort of end point. To me, that seems oddly optimistic when we're talking about social distancing in some form for the rest of the year. I just think we need to step back. I think the government did it in the last Premier League meeting when they stressed that football is not a special case. It's not viewed as much. We all think of football as our love and our as a special case. We love it that much. We're desperate for it to return. But the reality is we've just got to be careful. We've got to think of society first. I know there's a demand and a desire by football to return. They're desperate financially to keep the game going. But we have to be so sensible. It's unprecedented times. It's a unique situation. We've got to we really, metaphorically speaking, we've got to put our foot on the ball and be sensible.
Henry, if there is the understanding, we don't know when football is coming back, and a lot of this is fairly hypothetical. At the same time, is there a scenario in your mind where, when football does return, it isn't to pick up the end of last season's business? We've seen what Holland have done. I'm not just talking about at the top level here. We know what's happened in non-league football as well. But can you see a scenario? Is there a tipping point at which football doesn't come back and pick up where it left off?
Well, wouldn't that be terrible? I mean, I think that's what everyone wants, is that, and I completely echo Ollie Holt's sentiments. I mean, Martin and myself and Crossy have been sort of saying that for the last 5-6 weeks, that it's really important that football completes this season. It's not a Liverpool thing. It's not a Leeds thing. It's not simply about, the teams who have fought hard to get into the Champions League position. This is about a general sporting principle that you finish what you've started. And this is an unbelievable situation that this country, the world, is in. But what a moment it's going to be when football can finally just get going again and fans can walk back into the stadium and go, right, where were we? And you fight on. And that's, you can't surrender to adversity, even one as big as this. Look, at some point, and again, echoing Ollie's excellent piece, I think his conclusion is, I urge you to buy a paper and read the piece, but, his conclusion is effectively, if it comes down to points per game, and that's the way it's decided, then fair enough. But look, it will still be a huge asterisk against the season. But avoiding the season, which Karen Brady initially suggested and then slightly rode back in on, was, you can't avoid a season. I'm slightly disappointed with the path that the Dutch have gone down, and I wish the Germans luck. I echo Martin's points about the difficulties that the Bundesliga are sure to encounter, even if they do have a better medical situation than the UK at the moment. But there'll be a lot of eyes watching them. But you cannot rush back. It is as simple as that. Look, it's important for the fans, and I think one of the many things that has come out of this is that I think fans, when football does return, fans will be appreciated more by the clubs, by the Premier League itself. Because if you look at, football, say, does come back. What is it? I think there are, 50 odd games are contractually obligated to Sky and BT, and another sort of 40 odd up for grabs of the 92 still to be played in the Premier League. Well, if those are going to be without fans behind closed doors, and understandably that is sadly inevitable, then I think we'll appreciate properly, and football has to acknowledge this when it returns, how important fans are. You look at the fans of all clubs who've been going out and supporting the food banks, not simply during this pandemic, but before. You look at the support they give clubs home and away. You look at the backdrop they provide for broadcasters like Sky. They are absolutely vital. So I do think, we're all saying, well, we can't plan too far ahead, but I hope when football does return, the importance of fans in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of the lifeblood of the game, is properly appreciated. But at the moment, I can't see fans going back into grounds. But coming back to your initial question, I think voiding would be a surrender, and I don't want to face that yet.
OK, well, we have to take a break right now, but afterwards we'll be discussing the Dutch decision to end their season, which has already resulted in one club promising legal action. Welcome back to the Sunday Supplement. We are joined by Henry Winter of The Times, Martin Samuel of The Mail, and John Cross of The Mirror. Martin, I want to come to you, pick up on something you were saying earlier on about the Dutch decision, the Eredivisie, to finish their season. Now, they've awarded the Champions League places to Ajax and Alkmaar because they were joint level on top at the time. However, Utrecht, who finished outside of the Europa League places, have already said, we will be taking legal action. Do you think that the Premier League or potentially other leagues will look at that and think, well, there you go. There's another reason why we have to finish the season that we haven't so far?
Well, as you know, there's nothing that can't be improved with the 10 million quid lawsuit. So that's what's going to happen. You are going to get the odd chairman, you are going to get the odd club owner, league, whatever, who for some reason think the way to handle an unprecedented situation that nobody could have prepared for, that nobody could have, in the sporting context certainly, that what needs to be fed into the mix is a legal action dragging on however many years. You can't believe that they don't get it. You can't believe these people don't get it. You can't believe that nobody in the Dutch league realises what everyone is trying to do is find the best way forward, and none of it's ideal. I thought it was terribly unfair to void, curtail, call it what you will, all of the lower leagues where you had clubs that had already won promotion that were suddenly told none of that existed. You had clubs that were guaranteed to be in playoffs that were told none of that existed. Strangely, all the disciplinary fines and stuff existed. But, at the same time, I do appreciate that every single person who's making these decisions is trying to find the best way forward. So they to find a way forward. I'm not saying it would be my way. I'm not saying it's the best way, but they try to find a way. And if the reward is that FC Utrecht want to sue them probably sue them for more money than they ever get from playing in the Europa League, for instance. Well, that's what you're going to be up against.
How much, John, is it a difficulty in wrestling with these decisions that various leagues and administrators have to make? Is that there's not just the sporting integrity and the fairness to take into account, but there is also huge financial implications for decisions that they make.
Oh, listen, I do think at the heart of the Premier League's desperation to get going, I think is that TV deal, the threat of about £750 million made up of money from domestic broadcasters. And I think that, frankly, there's going to be less flexibility from foreign broadcasters. You have to be realistic about that and understand that I think that's driving some of the desperation. Where I think that basically... I think that the reality will probably mean at some stage soon we will very seriously have to consider curtailing the season, whether that's a points per game scenario or kind of this mini tournament that UEFA is talking about. Then I think that will be on the agenda. I think a few people confused the kind of UEFA Exco meeting last week and the kind of the talk about a mini tournament, playoffs, and little things about that as solutions for the domestic league. Well, they weren't really. It was solutions that UEFA were proposing for qualification for their tournaments, the Champions League and the Europa League. I think at this point, I do think that we will need strong leadership from the Premier League. I'm not sure that sometimes that they've been in unison and they've been together as much as the EFL clubs. I think the chairman at the EFL, Rick Parry, has done a terrific job. I really do. I think he's had vast experience across all levels of the game, working at a club, working at the Premier League. And I think that was a shrewd appointment. And I think that basically the Premier League will have to be strong on this. Where I think that basically a huge lawsuit will fail, and ultimately it should be made to fail by the Premier League, is that basically I think once you are a football club and you join the Premier League, you have to accept the fact that you're joining almost a private members club. You sign up for the league, you sign up to play in the Premier League, and that's where it should be. I'm not saying that clubs won't challenge that legally. I'm sure that they would. But I do think that sooner or later, the Premier League have got to stamp their authority on it and say, this is the way we're going to do it. I personally cannot see us realistically, and even from a moral standpoint, restarting any time particularly soon. So I think we either take a decision on this season and curtail it. Voiding, I think, it has to be off the table. It absolutely has to be off the table. But can we find a solution which is fair, not just to the Premier League clubs, but also to the EFL clubs with the likes of Leeds and West Brom, the best two teams, in the EFL, in my view, this season, not just from their league position either. Can you find a solution that fits all? Of course you can't. I don't think that it's one that's going to be particularly fair, but I do think that voiding is so grossly unfair. But I think at some point we're going to have to find some sort of strong solution to curtail it. Obviously, the Dutch, the Belgians.
When is that point, John? When is that point, John? When is that point?
Geoff, I think that's coming soon. I do. I mean, I read these stories about kind of us returning to training. Let's see how that goes. But it all breaks down again as soon as one player returns to training, and within the first week, as they surely will test positive for coronavirus. And we like to think that it'll be over by the peak, and we like to think that basically, football is going to return. It's going to give hope for the nation. But we also have to be realistic about this and say that I cannot see a point in time where football can safely return. And I think that is the greater worry for society, really.
One of the issues you've got is what constitutes a team, because you can say we could play it behind closed doors, right? We'll play it behind closed doors, we'll test and everything like that. And then, as John said, if one guy tests positive, then suddenly your team's in quarantine. So could you get a situation where, say, Watford are relegated because they've had to play the last 5 matches with the under-17 team because everyone else is in quarantine? So it's a really big issue for the clubs if you were to go back behind closed doors. What exactly is your team? Is it the 29, or because they were talking about 29 players being this expanded first team squad? Is it the 29? Is it the existing 25? Or is it any 11 red shirts that go out there, and that's your team, and then you take it, win or lose? Because you could get some almightily unfair, you could get some mismatches and horrendous instances of injustice if you were to go out and then say, well, whatever 11 players you can get out on the pitch, that's your team. And if it's the cleaning lady and the chairman up front, well, that's what it is. There's so much. I know it sounds horrendous to bring it back to money, but let's be honest, this is what an awful lot of it is about. There is so much money at stake between being in the Premier League and the Championship that no one is willing to take that risk that we play the season, and if half the team are in quarantine, or if our best 5 players are in quarantine, or the whole team is in quarantine, we risk going down. No one is willing to take that risk. And that's why you hear a lot of people talking about curtailment rather than something I think a lot of people would like to see, which is, we start again when we start again, and we finish this season and then we worry about starting the next one. But, it's the relegation issue that is key to all of these clubs that are threatened by it, that bottom 7 or 8.
Henry, we have, of course, a new chairman of the Premier League in the shape of Gary Hoffman. What do you think he will bring to the role, and particularly in these hugely difficult and unprecedented times?
Well, Gary Hoffman, I mean, it's a good appointment. I mean, I quite like the idea of former players bringing some of the experience of the dressing room into the boardrooms. But I think at a time like this, a financial individual like Gary Hoffman, who has got amazing experience, and with Northern Rock, with former sponsors of the Premier League, and I think Barclaycard or Barclays. I mean, the league is going to need a serious financial individual there to sort of guide it through the next 2-3 years. So I think he's really important. But what I think is also interesting about Gary Hoffman's background is that he knows Coventry City well. I think I've sat next to him about 4 or 5 events, and 6 or 7 of those he spoke just all the time about Coventry. He's mad about Coventry City. I think that's important, and sort of echoing some of the boys' points about this is not simply a Premier League issue. That we have to consider the sanctity and the importance of the pyramid to keep them all safe. Obviously, we've lost Berry this season, but also as a pathway for coaches and players to progress from down the pyramid into the elite levels. And I think Gary Hoffman's experience outside of the Premier League, his love of Coventry City, and also remember I think he was chairman of the Football Foundation. And when he went in there in, I think it was 2011, one of the first things he said was it's very important for the Premier League to appreciate that the grassroots of the game is the bedrock of the game, and things start from there. So I think there's a sort of broader picture here is that football at the elite end understands its place at the top of the pyramid, and it is supported by the clubs down the pyramid into non-league, and it supports them financially. So it's about protecting them as well. And just coming back to one of Martin's, as usual, one of his very erudite points, what is going to happen when we do play games and say Liverpool get the points they need to win the title, and this is on Martin's point about the makeup of the actual squad, is Jurgen Klopp, as he's got every right to do, say, right, I'm going to focus on next season, and I'm going to rest some of my stars. What will the broadcasters think of that? What will that mean then to the other teams that they're going to be playing? So look, there's a host of problems. I mean, PPG, points per game, I can understand that it may well come down to that because no one wants voiding. But then again, that doesn't take into account previous form. Look at the impact that Nigel Pearson's had at Watford. Norwich City have got a belief there, particularly at Carrow Road, that they're not out of it yet. So, you've got to look at also the nature of the oppositions that they're going to be playing, as well as Martin's point about the nature of the individual teams and who can actually call upon. So look, there are many issues here, but the central point is football cannot rush back with the mortality rate as it is, with the peak period of this pandemic that the UK has only just entered and could well last for, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but the NHS experts say the curve is heading into the peak now. So football cannot even really consider coming back anytime soon.
And Henry, when you mentioned PPG, have a look at League One, for instance. How do you decide that? How could you decide a promotion issue in League One on PPG at the moment? Because it's so close, and I think how many points separates the first 4 or 5 teams? And to then go, right, well, what we'll do, we'll take points per game, and you don't come up because you're 0.3 points behind somebody else. I mean, we know how easily 5 points can be overturned in a league season. It's PPG works in. You can certainly make it work in the Premier League. I'm not sure you can make PPG work with relegation issues, because I'm not sure, going back to the legal point, I'm not sure a club would accept being relegated on PPG. And certainly some of the promotion issues are far, far tighter than the top of Premier League and the top 2 teams in the Championship.
Yeah, John, isn't that in a nutshell the problem? Because you want to do the right thing for the whole of the game, but inevitably self-interest will come to the fore, and therefore a lot of the time that self-interest is because the differing situations financially for each club as well, it's not impossible to have a common objective.
Yeah, and do you know what? I don't blame the club for that, simply because I think that it's a natural reaction, isn't it, the self-interest thing? And people berate, sort of kind of, chief executives, owners putting forward ideas, about not having, for example, one idea, quite apart from voiding the season, was not having relegation. You're going to protect your own interest, aren't you? It's a natural reaction. I really think it should be important to echo, though, Henry's point there about we cannot have the current mortality rate or anything close to it, and entertain a notion whereby the FA a few weeks back said, look, we can put forward Wembley to use through this crisis. And it was a good gesture, but Wembley, frankly, the only thing viable really in crude terms that Wembley could be used for was a mortuary, basically. So you could have Wembley at one end of the North Circular Road, basically in North London, being used as a mortuary, and football being played at White Hart Lane on the other end of the North Circular Road. It's just beyond, any sort of moral issue. I just don't understand that. We have to be realistic about this. We have to get through this period. Listen, I think it's also important to note that football is a huge industry, a huge part of our society. We love it. But also it's such a big thing that financially that we have to try and, sort of balance the need to keep clubs going, to keep clubs afloat. We overlook the fact that a lot of these Premier League clubs, incredibly wealthy owners, but they've got fixed costs, they've got wages. You go through the three divisions in the EFL, and they're desperate for money at the moment. So I do think we have to be realistic about this, but finding that sort of formula is going to be so difficult at the moment. And I do think that's why ultimately I come back to the point that basically I think I'd be surprised if we can finish this season. I think the reality is that we'll probably end up having to find a formula for curtailment.
Well, speaking of realism, we've got to take a break right now, but afterwards we'll be discussing Ed Woodward's comments where he says football needs a reality check and it certainly won't be business as usual with regards to the transfer market. Join us after this. Now, understandably, we've been focusing on the Sunday supplement this morning on the financial aspect of football, when it will come back, what it could mean, who could lose out, who could potentially profit from the situation, which in many ways is perhaps a little unfair because, of course, throughout this crisis, football in many, many areas has stepped up to the mark and done some remarkable things. Henry, has anything in particular caught your eye?
Well, yeah, quite a few. I mean, you look at Chelsea, they were the first to actually put up their hotel. I think they've had about 140 of their rooms are being used by NHS staff. Gary Neville, obviously, with what he's done with his hotels. I think it's been fantastic. I think the reaction of so many within football, you look at Plymouth Argyle, we're moving out of the Premier League. You look, they immediately gave over home park to the NHS. Tottenham Hotspur, obviously, they made the mistake over furloughing, but they've now used their new stadium for, I think it's a testing centre as well. You look at Arsenal with their incredible foundation, the work they're doing. Manchester United and Manchester City were immediately involved in food banks as well. So I think, whether it's supporters initiatives, which we know how sort of good they are and how embedded in the community the fans are, but actually if you look at the clubs are so involved as well. I mean, just coming back to Chelsea, they've got involved with Refuge UK, just helping them financially and spreading awareness that there's likely to be, as there has been, a spike in figures of domestic abuse. So look, I think we should have a nod to the clubs for the work they've been doing, and also the players as well, the Players Together initiative. You look at the work that Jordan Henderson and Kevin De Bruyne and Bellerin and individuals like that have been doing, as well as the stuff that they've been doing privately as well. So listen, sort of football, we focus on all the money, but I think we should also give a nod to the amazing good initiatives privately and publicly that the clubs and the players are doing.
Yeah, I do think that the Players Together, I think, was a wonderful initiative. It answered back also, I think, some of the criticism, which I think was incredibly unfairly placed and levelled at the players' door, frankly, that at a time when pay cuts and deferrals were being talked about, the notion then that players were being selfish and greedy, frankly, is just nonsense. A lot of the players, I think, that they don't seek credit or praise for some of the stuff that they do. I mean, for some of the overseas players, they've given generously to Players Together, for example, from a domestic point of view towards the NHS charities. But obviously, if you're a foreign player, I think your natural instinct is to also try and seek out and help at home. I mean, and many of these players are almost giving sort of kind of 3 times over, if you like. They're giving some money back to the club, and it is their money. I think, in wage cuts and deferrals. They're giving money towards the players together, and they're also sending money back for charities closer to home. I think that, the generosity, I think, from the players, I think is overlooked. And I think fair play to some of them and I understand the arguments about not wanting to get into particularly into pay cuts, because they would rather give their money to sort of charities than back to their own clubs. And it's a very, very fair argument, and it's something that's put forward by the PFA. But it's football at all levels. I mean, Roman Abramovich has been outstanding on this. I mean, he's a Russian billionaire who, frankly, when he arrived in this country, wasn't given a particularly warm welcome. But the work that he and Chelsea have done has been remarkable, putting a few English billionaires to shame, let me tell you. And then it's clubs across the board in Premier League level, from Arsenal, from Man City to Man United doing wonderful things. Look at what Leeds are doing. Look at what Portsmouth, and I was alerted this week to something, that Middlesbrough are doing. And absolutely across the board at all levels, football clubs are playing their part in community. And that shows, I think, why football is so important to our life, why football is beyond just sport, and why I think it deserves respect and support at this time, because football together makes such a difference, such an impact on a community and society level.
On that note, John, I ought to give a little shout out to our very own Alan Smith, who today has taken up the 2.6 challenge. I think you can see there he's washing 26 cars in St Albans to raise money for charity. I think you've got a glimpse there. I mean, that is Smudger in his shorts, which is an alarming sight at the best of times. So, well done, Smudge. Good luck with that. Martin, John touched on it there. How delicate or otherwise do you think negotiations have been, and between clubs and players, the difference between deferrals and pay cuts? What have you made of that scenario?
Well, from the very start, the PFA were not particularly helpful. The Premier League mismanaged the whole issue, so it's just broken down in discussions about trust and about whether you trust people. And the PFA want everyone to open their books, which you pay good money for irony like that over the West End, but some of the clubs have agreed, and there's unity. I think a lot of it depends on the strength of the leaders in your dressing room. I don't think it was a great coincidence that Mark Noble managed to persuade the West Ham dressing room to take the deferral. And then at Arsenal, you've got huge divisions with people like Mesut Ozil and other players in the dressing room apparently not agreeing with the rest of the players. So I think a lot of it is to do with leadership. A lot of it is to do with the individuals you've got, with having strong individuals in your dressing room and being able to see both sides. I find it quite strange. I really did think that all players would just go, we've been very generously treated here. We're very generously paid. We can see your point of view. I thought that would happen. I thought that would happen a lot swifter than it has done.
Now, I know that, we don't actually know the truth of exactly what the situation at Arsenal is in terms of who has agreed and who hasn't. I know Mesut Ozil's name has been highlighted, but the accuracy of that I'm not entirely certain of. But, John, it's a club you know well. What are you hearing in terms of the negotiations happening there?
Yeah, look, I feel really passionate about this. I think, it's a story that I've obviously written. I think immediately people think, oh, you're being critical. I'm really not. I think that basically, Hector Bellerin is the PFA, and I actually think he's a very, very good voice. He's a very respected voice amongst them. But there you have some players, and, even up until the start of last weekend, I think you had 7 players who didn't particularly want to accept the 12.5% pay cut that Arsenal were proposing. Mesut Ozil is a strong-willed player, an individual, and I actually think that he is incredibly generous, I think, in his donations. And I think it's his right, his prerogative to say, I might do it further down the line, which I understand that, he has done. I might take a pay cut further down the line. I might do a deferral further down the line. I would like to see, bearing in mind that basically the PFA have, urged players not to take pay cuts. They're of the mind that sort of kind of it's a deferral. And Arsenal could save £25 million for this. Well, it basically that goes back into the club unless they've qualified for the Champions League. So you could argue that basically the £12.5 million that basically that the government misses out on there because of, that's what the players would therefore be paying in tax is a very valid argument, perhaps for not taking a pay cut, because then that goes back into the NHS. I can't stress enough that someone like Ozil, look at what he does worldwide. I mean, there's no issue there about a generosity aspect. He's incredibly generous. And I think that goes for so many players. And I think that when you find time and again that basically if there's a discussion or debate to be had at any Premier League club, it's not about greed. It's about wanting to give that money back rather than to their football club, but back to society. And I think that that's something that should be respected. Listen, ideally, of course, you don't by dressing room. I feel really strongly that basically a lot of these players who are sort of resisting pay cuts, the reason they're doing it is because they want to give their money, and it is their money, generously to the causes that they support. And I applaud them for doing so. And we should actually respect that.
The NHS have never had more money than they've got at the moment. That's all you'd argue with that, is that the NHS has never had more money being thrown at it than it has at the moment. And actually, it's got a massive bureaucracy that makes that very, very hard to spend. When the NHS will need money is when the reckoning comes at the end of all this, when the coronavirus bill kicks in. You've got £83 billion set aside in the NHS to fight lawsuits, for instance, with people suing them all the time. And they will do it over coronavirus, because those first lawsuits are beginning to arrive in other countries already. They're beginning to arrive in Italy. People are suing the health service. So that's when the NHS are going to need money. So I understand it's all wonderful that everyone wants to give to the NHS. Actually, it's the players, it's the clubs that are actually have got a problem, and it's a temporary problem. One would hope solved by temporary deferrals, and that's what I don't understand. So I say, they're giving to the NHS, which is fantastic, marvellous. Time to give to the NHS. Give it 12 months. That's when they'll really, really need the money, because that's when the reckoning is coming. The next 12 months, 2 years, 3 years. That's when the coronavirus reckoning is coming. And will it all still exist then? Will people still be given 30% of their wages then? Probably not, because this is the moment now, and everyone is steering it towards the NHS, when actually it's the clubs whose need is greatest. I'm not saying every club, but certainly you look at clubs in the Championship, you look at clubs below the Championship. That's a real great need at the moment.
It's also about the spirit and the unity of a club. If you are on the non-football playing staff at a club and you are suffering, even if you haven't been furloughed, even if your own sort of wages haven't been cut, everyone is suffering out there. You actually want to know that the real stars of the club are actually taking the initiative internally in terms of deferrals, as Martin was saying. We understand how much amazing work that the players do initially, and we've discussed that. And Mesut, I think it's slightly unfair that he's been singled out, because as Crossy says, he does a remarkable amount of work with his charities sort of out with the UK, as well as some within the UK. But I do think that in terms of the spirit at the club, spirit at the training ground, everyone has to be on board with this. And as Martin was saying about sort of Mark Noble, the fact that the staff at West Ham will be able to look at the players in the West Ham dressing room and say, right, you stood shoulder to shoulder with us in this difficult time.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly, Henry, your thoughts. Do you think another reason for players resisting pay cuts as such, the back of their minds would think, OK, we take a pay cut now, but come the opening of the transfer window, our club could well bid 100 million or whatever for a new player, and that doesn't sit right with them?
Well, I think all the headlines about Jadon Sancho going for 100 million, Harry Kane going for 200 million. I mean, first, let's have a reality check in terms of, as Ed Woodward was indicating, in terms of what the shape that the transfer market's going to be in when football finally returns. I think there will be a backlash against big fees. I think there will be an issue with wages as well. So absolutely, and I imagine the players are also looking at the money that these owners actually have at home, that they have. These are incredibly wealthy individuals. But absolutely, in terms of camaraderie, in terms of collectivity, and in terms of doing the right thing, there should be deferrals.
Okay, we have to take a break right now, but afterwards we'll be discussing, well, a topic that's already garnered a huge amount of debate, and that is the potential takeover of Newcastle United. Welcome back to the Sunday Supplement. As we said, there may be no football right now, but there is plenty to write about. And I don't think there is any hotter topic in terms of a takeover than Newcastle United, mainly down to the Saudi Arabian element of the potential takeover. Martin, what's your take on this? And also, do you think there will be any appetite whatsoever from either government or indeed Premier League to step in? Or indeed, should there be?
Well, government, absolutely not. You cannot trade with Saudi Arabia, be in business in alliances with Saudi Arabia, and then expect Newcastle to football them into submission. So government, no. Premier League, no. They like the narrative. They like new money coming into the game. So I don't see any official objection to it whatsoever. My own personal position on it was that I was very sceptical at the start because there's been so many near misses with Newcastle takeovers where the money's mysteriously not been there or the person just sort of disappeared into the mist when it came to it. So I began from a sceptical position. I think this one's genuine. I think this one goes through. I think it works as a business proposition. What they'll be able to do once they're in there, however, is a completely different thing, because I know the Newcastle fans will be expecting a massive influx of money, and there will be more money in the club, in the facilities of the club, in the structure of the club, and more money in the transfer market as well. But the financial fair play rules are there to stop owner investment. And Newcastle will find it very, very difficult to get around those rules. As Manchester City are finding it very, very difficult to put their money into the club, as any new owner finds it difficult to put the money in, because what we seem to like in football is people taking money out of football. They don't like putting money in for some reason. All the rules are there to stop you putting money in, but you can take plenty out. So that's what it's there for, and I do fear that Newcastle, the fans will be delighted because they've got rid of Mike Ashley. So they will be delighted by that. But in terms of being able to grow the club and making a short-term impact on those elite teams, I think it could be quite frustrating for them, for the owners as well.
Henry, Martin has addressed the side in terms of, or the government position in terms of the Saudi Arabian involvement. Of course, there's a huge amount of historical trade between the two countries anyway. But is there potentially more? What are you hearing in terms of the number of other stakeholders in the Premier League objecting because of what has happened in the Middle East in terms of beIN Sport and their output being hijacked by Saudi Arabia and losing huge amounts of money?
Well, that will be a bigger issue for football, which doesn't have too big a moral compass. The bigger issue will be broadcast rights, not human rights, I think, when it comes down to it. Look, there's very much two sort of narratives at play here. First, the desire amongst Newcastle United fans to effectively to have a liberation after the occupation of Mike Ashley of their great club for 13 years. It's been a very cold, sterile experience, even as an outsider, to go up there, and someone who has great affinity to the club like I do, and just sort of talk to the supporters there. You could just see how much they were hating the joylessness of the Mike Ashley era. The things that he stands for is completely antithetical to Newcastle, which is just that chance to dream. I mean, Newcastle fans are not stupid. They're not expecting to win the Champions League. They're not expecting really to win the league, but they want a chance. They want some hope that they can actually see pride in the shirt, see attacking football, see that, the likes of another Ginola, another Shearer, players like that who wore the shirt with pride playing for them again. But they've got some decent players now, but it's a very under-resourced squad. So I can see, I've read a lot of pieces about Newcastle United fans and what their desire for this takeover, this desire to get rid of Mike Ashley. And I think people who write these papers, and I see a lot of comments on social media, go to Newcastle, spend time with the Newcastle United fans, have actually experienced what's happened in Newcastle during this 13-year occupation by Mike Ashley of their club. And I think you'll understand why the Newcastle fans are so keen to move Mike Ashley out. Now, there's the next issue is, are the Saudis the right owners for the club? Personally, and I've been talking to them, there are a couple of strong American bids who one with strong sporting connections and one an incredibly wealthy individual, even by American standards, very wealthy individual. But obviously in this period of exclusivity, they cannot move. So I agree with Martin. I think it will be weighed through. The government certainly aren't going to get involved. You might have one or two politicians piping up and saying it's wrong. But then, if as a country, we're saying so much in military aid. This is military aid. It's not even humanitarian aid we're necessarily sending to Saudi Arabia. I don't think the government will get involved. The Premier League, as Martin says, like the idea of new money. They like the idea of a new narrative. I think there's an issue with the connection with Sheffield United that needs highlighting. I do think it is embarrassing that you've got a country, a state, which has, you only got to read the Amnesty International report into some of the things that have been connected to the Saudi royal family. And from a journalistic perspective, what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, and we all saw his widow's letter to the Premier League, very emotional letter to the Premier League. And I think there are serious human rights concerns. And I think if the takeover does go through, there will be demonstrations outside St James's Park. But I think if anything is going to derail this bid, and I still think it will go through, I agree with Martin on that, it will be the issue of the broadcast rights, because the thoughts of a wealthy overseas broadcaster like being upset, that will rankle with other clubs as well. But actually, my first thoughts are actually with the Newcastle United fans, because they're the ones who are in the middle of this. They're the ones who've had to live through Mike Ashley. The last time I fell out with the Newcastle United fans and lost a bet with them, I had to swim the Tyne. So I'm going to back them on this one. I really think that this is a huge moment for them, the whole cans thing that they're talking about how they're going to celebrate. But I think we all need to urge some caution when the takeover does go through, that the focus on human rights in Saudi Arabia will become even more intense. And I think the Newcastle United fans and the club have to be aware of that as they go into this takeover.
John, does it show how ludicrous the scenario is? We're talking about human rights, we're talking about broadcasting rights as well. But there's already been speculation about Steve Bruce's position should the takeover go through. And I have to say, it begged belief when I saw one story saying that he would be given until the end of the season. What season?
Well, exactly. I mean, where does it start? I mean, listen, I completely understand it from Newcastle fans' point of view, and I think I must say I think the potential takeover, really troubles me much more from a moral point of view than it does from the TV rights point of view, which is clearly a very individual kind of dispute between two nations and two areas there. And listen, I just think that you can't blame the Newcastle fans for thriving on that hope. But that doesn't then separate the fact that basically I think over the last week or so we've been absolutely right and I have to say I don't think it's from all areas to question the moral aspect, the human rights aspect, which I think is a massive thing. But moving on from that, I just feel that basically it is ridiculous that, Steve Bruce, to all intents and purposes, when you consider how unhappy Newcastle fans are, simply because of perhaps the lack of investment, the lack of support, I think you step back and then say, well, amidst that and in that context, what an incredible job of work Steve Bruce has done. Yes, sometimes I get the fact that it's not the football that they want. Yes, I get the fact that basically he's associated almost, despite being obviously a lifelong Newcastle fan and Geordie himself, he's associated as Mike Ashley's man. Well, he's not been that man for my point of view. And I think he deserves a great deal more respect than he's often shown. I think he's done a very good job. I think his record compares favourably to Rafa Benitez. He's not as sexy, obviously. And basically, equally, though, I don't blame the Newcastle fans for kind of seizing onto that hope for a brighter future, as they're clearly doing now. But I think, given the opportunity, given the tools and the support, and that he potentially gets from better, different owners, then I think Steve Bruce can do a job. I also think it's just worth touching upon. We've had a lot of scepticism about foreign ownership before, haven't we? And I understand this is completely different from a moral point of view. I remember writing about it, about the Abramovich takeover and being questioned about Chelsea. Look at what he did for the Premier League and for Chelsea. Look at what Man City, since their takeover has done for that particular area of Manchester. And I cannot deny, I love Man City and what they stand for because of the football that they play. Yes, there's always going to be questions about the investment and what's going on at the moment, but you cannot tell me that basically foreign ownership on some level has been fantastic for the Premier League. But I do think from a moral standpoint, Newcastle is a case that must continue to be questioned and sort of very looked at very, very intently, I think.
You say question, John. Sound isn't perfect on these devices. Did you actually say that Steve Bruce isn't as sexy as Rafa Benitez? Because that is a whole different debate. But we have to take a break right now, and after which we'll be talking Phil Neville and the Lionesses. Now, this week, the FA issued a statement saying that Phil Neville will be leaving his post at the end of his contract. Now, the complication, of course, is that the Euros have been moved back and also the Olympics actually start. Obviously, the Lionesses have already qualified for those. The Olympics start a few weeks after his actual contract ends as well next summer. So a huge mess. Henry, what do you read into this and also how it's been handled?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, you look at where the story was very well sourced. It came from Matt Lawton, The Times, and also Dom King at the Mail as well. And I mean, it was probably inevitable. And I think the interesting thing now is how much of a role Phil Neville has in appointing his successor. I think that it's something that Martin mentioned in his column the other day that because of the FA pathway, I think it should be a woman who manages the England women's team. And then I think if you take that, I think you look at Casey Stoney at Manchester United. Right. So I agree with you that it hasn't been handled well in terms of the way the FA have allowed the news to come out. But I think they have to make the right step forward now. And, you look at Emma Hayes at Chelsea. I know she's on record as saying she doesn't want to leave Chelsea. She's got big ambitions with the club. But there's some talented female coaches out there. You can go to America and look at Jill Ellis, who I think was born near Portsmouth as well. So there are some talented candidates. And Casey Stoney at Manchester United, another year when football starts coming back, then that she's incredibly talented. I'm sure some of the former players will look at her playing pedigree as well and the number of caps that she won with the Lionesses, and I think that will, that will be well received in the dressing room. But okay, the FA may not have handled it particularly well, but I think they've actually got to move on for that and make sure they get the right person long term.
Martin, as Henry said there, that we understand that the brief is that the next appointment should be a woman. That certainly seems to be the consensus of opinion. What do you make of that declaration? Should it not be the best person for the job?
No, it shouldn't. It should be the best. It should be the best English-born coach for the job. I've always believed the national manager of the national team should be from the country. Should be from that country. I never agreed with foreign managers of the England team, the England men's team. I think it's a form of cheating, and it's not illegal cheating, but I think it's meant to be international football. It's meant to be the best of yours against the best of theirs, and if it's not, well, then what's the point of it, really? So I do believe that the national coach should be from that country. And as it's the England women's team, I think it should be a female coach, because you've got to show this is the premier job for an English female coach, and we're going to give it to an English female coach. We're not going to just pluck someone from the men's game and say, have this because everyone's heard of you. I'm not saying that's why Phil Neville got it necessarily, but you can't just cherry pick from outside of that realm, and you've got to give people encouragement. You've got to say, look, if you are a good coach, we've got a way forward for you. We have got a way forward for you to get the top job in the country. And I thought we should have started after Mark Sampson, but if we can't start after Mark Sampson, let's start after Phil Neville.
John, it's my understanding that there are more male coaches in the WSL than female. So again, I'll put the same point to you. Do you think it is appropriate to be gender specific about the next coach?
I think it's an odd one. I must say it's clearly directed put forward. As I read, this week by Sue Campbell, wasn't it? Sort of head of the women's national game, really. And I do think it's a strange one, because I think it takes me back to the point that I think should be made, in that basically Phil Neville, I think his appointment to the role in the first place was met with criticism, scepticism, and I just think he defied all that. He did a very, very good job. He gave it, a profile, and we have to accept that, whether we like it or not. It was a high-profile appointment, and I think he did really, really well. I mean, if you take it up to the World Cup in isolation, I think Phil Neville deserves an awful lot of credit for the job that he did. I mean, after that, clearly results, have fallen away. You wonder whether that is partly because I think of a degree of what happens next. It never sits well with me when you have this doubt whether the manager is going to go or not, because I think any uncertainty, I think, is seized on by players, and results tend to fade away, as I think as they've done in this case. I actually think that basically you appoint, I think, the best person for the job. That's not necessarily a male or female appointment. I'm surprised that is being such a clear directive, such a clear thing. And I actually feel quite strongly about this, that you always go for the best person for the job. I think the ideal for the men's game is obviously it goes through the pathway, it goes through St George's Park. Of course, you want to follow that. And of course, I think the FA want to follow that for Gareth Southgate's successors. So why not in the women's thing? But I'm just not quite sure that basically the coaches were out there. But I just feel as if you should appoint the best person possible for the role, and to take on this job and to push it on to the next level, because I do think that Phil Neville has taken it on and really improved, I think, the women's national team.
I totally take Geoff's point about the number of men's coaches in the women's game. The England national team is different. They're clubs, and this is my point about national football. And that if it's not the best of yours, well, then there's no point in it. It's no different to clubs. Clubs can have who they want in charge. They're private companies. They appoint who they want. This is the national team. It means a little bit more. There is a point at which you've got to say, right, if we don't set the example, who does set the example? If we don't say to women coaches, we will encourage you. We will encourage you. We will promote you to the pinnacle of your game. If the FA aren't prepared to do that, well, who is prepared to do that? You can't rely on the clubs to do that because the clubs are private enterprises. They're there to make money, ostensibly, in the men's game. So, you know, I think it's a totally different thing being the national coach. Totally different thing.
Henry, where does it leave the Lionesses right now? Because, as we said, they qualified for the Olympics. The players, we understand, are upset because they only found out via the media that Phil Neville's contract would not be renewed. And they've got no qualifiers to play for the next 11 months.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's just. It's a crazy situation that they're in. So absolutely, the FA have got to appoint someone. But I mean, it's very interesting. Your point to Martin about the number of male coaches in the women's game. I mean, let's take this on a few years. When are we going to have female coaches in the men's game? I mean, anyone who's spent any time talking to Emma Hayes, I can absolutely see her stepping into the English men's game at some point. So let's broaden the debate out a little bit on this, and let's not get too sort of gender specific on it. The other issue here is that the FA have built a magnificent £120 million effectively coaching hub at St George's Park, and females, males are going through this amazing pro license setup they've got there, and absolutely they have to have that pathway. But in terms of the Lionesses, I can imagine there's pure frustration at the moment.
In terms of the sort of job that Phil did, though, Martin, what sort of legacy as such do you think he leaves at the Lionesses? How would you assess the job he did?
I don't think Phil Neville did a bad job at all. He's got a lot of criticism at the end of it. I mean, the last time I think I was on this programme when we could all meet in the same room, we were talking about Phil Neville and the job that he'd done. And I think I was alone in saying that what we've got to improve with the England women's team is there's got to be a technical improvement. There's got, you know, because our pass completion rates are not as good as the other leading nations. And in the end, what will happen, unless we improve that side of the game, unless we improve technically, is that everyone will overtake us, which is exactly what happened with the men's team, that once you began to take physicality out of it and once it became a much more possession-based game, the international football, we fell behind. And that is what has happened with the England team. And if there is a failure in Phil Neville's regime, is that he hasn't managed to achieve as much in that technical area as he hoped to. He definitely wanted to make England more of a passing team, less of a team that banged it into the channels and chased it, less of an old-fashioned English team. And that hasn't really been seen through to the end. And that's probably the disappointment of Phil Neville's regime. But I don't think he did a bad job, and I certainly think his intentions were right. I certainly think what he aimed for was what England should be aiming for.
John, very, very briefly, do you think Phil Neville's stock has risen and there'll be clubs interested in him?
Yes, I do. I do think he overall. I think if you take it, I take on board what Martin said there, but I do think that basically I'm sure will now look to get back into management again. It's a very, very strange position for him, isn't it? That basically he sees out the remaining contract. I don't think that's something that anyone will relish, because it's very difficult in this state of limbo as we know it already. But I do think there will be takers, and I do think that basically, whether that's back in the women's game.
Okay, John, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you for your time. Allow us to have this Sunday supplement come through the keyhole. Thank you for joining us from your homes. We'll be back next week, Sunday supplement, 10 a.m. Make sure you join us. Thanks for your company this morning.